Why just anything and everything doesn't come into being from nothing? Why don't bicycles and gasoline stations and planets and beer and Beethoven pop into being uncaused out of nothing? Otherwise, I think what our friend is talking about is just mumbo jumbo.
Welcome to another episode of Podkast, Science and Theology, the premier channel in the Balkans dedicated to science and religion. I'm your host, Nemanja Jurišić. Today we have the extraordinary honor of hosting one of the most renowned American Christian apologist, theologian, and philosopher, Dr. Craig. Welcome, and how are you?
Good to be with you, Nemanja. I'm well. I'm glad to do this interview today with you.
Great. I'm excited about our discussion today. For those who don't know, Dr. William Lane Craig earned his PhD in philosophy from the University of Birmingham and a PhD in theology from the University of Munich. He received his Master of Divinity summa cum laude from the Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Deerfield, Illinois, and also BA from Wheaton College. He is author of numerous works and books, and particularly known for his designed Kalam Cosmological argument. And that is exactly today's topic. Dr. Craig, before we start, can you just present the logical form of the Kalam Cosmological argument, the two premises and conclusion?
Certainly. The argument is very simple. It consists of just three steps. Premise one is that whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise two is that the universe began to exist, and the conclusion, number three, is that therefore the universe has a cause. And then one will do a conceptual analysis of what it is to be a cause of the universe, and a striking number of theologically significant properties of this first cause fall out of such an analysis.
Great, thank you. Now I will pose several critical questions and objections regarding the first stage of the Kalam argument. Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay, first question. How do we know that causation applies to the beginning of existence rather than just the changes within an existing framework? If we rely on intuition, it's not always a reliable path to metaphysical truth. For example, quantum mechanics or a theory of relativity. And intuition is begging the question. Also, Rod Miksa, in his paper, claims that if you deny Kalam's causal principle, you're enslaved by absurdity, because an absurd universe where cognitive faculties are unreliable as likely as the normal universe. What do you think about this counter-argument?
It seems to me that the principle that whatever begins to exist has a cause is much more evidently true than the principle that you enunciated, that changes within an existing framework have to have a cause. I could well imagine that not every change within an existing framework has a cause, but I cannot imagine that things can begin to exist without any cause whatsoever. And in my published work, I give three arguments in support of this causal premise. The first one is that it is based upon the metaphysical first principle that out of nothing, nothing comes. Being does not come from non-being. Something cannot come out of nothing. This is one of the oldest principles of metaphysics, going all the way back prior to Plato and to Parmenides. So the causal principle is not a physical law or a natural law like the laws of thermodynamics or Boyle's laws of ideal gases. It is rather a metaphysical first principle that governs being as being. It governs all existence. And therefore, if the universe began to exist, the universe would have to have a cause, because it cannot just pop into existence out of nothing. Now, secondly, I argued that if things could come into being from nothing, then it becomes inexplicable why just anything and everything doesn't come into being from nothing. Why don't bicycles and gasoline stations and planets and beer and Beethoven pop into being uncaused out of nothing? There are no constraints on nothingness. So if things could come into being uncaused from nothing, we should see this happening all the time, which we don't. And that gives, I think, very good reason to think that, in fact, it's impossible that something can come into being from nothing. The third reason is an inductive reason, and that is, namely, when we survey things that begin to exist, we always find that they have causes that explain the origin of their existence. When you look at things that begin to exist, we never find them popping into being uncaused from nothing. And so we have the most powerful scientific and empirical inductive evidence in support of this principle. And I think that this basis for the causal principle gives very good grounds for believing that this is a true metaphysical principle, and therefore it is not undermined by the curiosities that you mentioned in quantum mechanics or the theory of relativity. Certainly, these scientific theories are weird, but they don't posit anything like being coming into reality from non-being. Now, as for this fellow you mentioned, Rad Mixa, I'm not familiar with him, but I must say his argument, as you explain it, mystifies me. He says that if you deny the causal premise, then you are enslaved by absurdity. Well, that seems to me to give powerful reason for not denying the causal principle. If you deny the causal principle, you're enslaved by absurdity. Who wants to be enslaved by absurdity? Surely we should affirm the causal principle and therefore be able to rationally operate in the universe. So I don't think his argument gives any good grounds for denying the causal principle.
All right. And what about intuition? Can we rely on that?
Oh, I think in metaphysics, that intuition is an important guide to reality, especially when it is so deeply seated as the principle that out of nothing, nothing comes. To deny that principle would be to undermine the very foundations of science. It would make science and reasoning impossible. Indeed, as this Rod Mixa says, it would land you in just complete absurdity. So it does seem to me that we have good grounds for following our metaphysical intuitions here, that being does not come from non-being.
All right, thank you. Next question is, does the concept of beginning to exist even make sense when applied to the universe as a whole, since time itself may have begun with the universe?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it certainly does. And indeed, it is commonplace in contemporary cosmological discussions to ask about the beginning of the universe. This is a very common question in astrophysics and astronomy. Did the universe begin to exist? And I would say a great many cosmologists affirm and think that it did begin to exist. This would be problematic only if you think that in order to begin to exist, there needs to be a time before which the thing existed. If you say that, then time couldn't begin to exist because there would have to be a time before time, which is self-contradictory. Fortunately, however, we needn't adopt such a defective definition of beginning to exist. In my work, I define beginning to exist in the following way. An entity X begins to exist at a time t if X comes into being at T. And I then define that locution, X comes into being at T, if and only if, number one, X exists at T. Number two, T is the first time at which X exists. And number three, X's existing at T is a tensed fact, that temporal becoming is a real and objective feature of reality. And given that understanding of beginning to exist, it is wholly unproblematic to say that time began to exist and that the universe began to exist.
Amazing answer. Okay. Next question. Is it possible that our concepts of causation and time break down when applied to the origins of the universe, rendering premise one meaningless?
Our physical concepts of time may break down at the beginning of the universe. That is certainly possible. But it's so important to remember that we're doing metaphysics here, not physics. And I see no reason to think that the metaphysical concept of time is dependent upon the universe or would break down at the beginning of the universe. Indeed, we can talk about the very beginning of time, as I just mentioned. So I don't think that our metaphysical concepts of causation and time break down when applied to the origins of the universe.
Great. Is it possible that the causal principle is an emergent property of the universe rather than a fundamental law that governs the universe's origin?
Well, I think that question has already been implicitly answered in what I've said. The causal principle, as I enunciated, is a metaphysical first principle. It's not like a law of nature that governs the universe. Contrast, for example, the laws of thermodynamics. The laws of thermodynamics operate and hold within the universe. But the causal principle is not a physical law. It is a metaphysical principle, and therefore would apply to the universe itself as something that exists and indeed something that came into being, and therefore would need to have a cause.
Nice, thank you. Is the notion of causation meaningful when applied to the origin of the universe, or does it presuppose a framework of time and space that may not have existed prior to the universe's beginning?
Again, I don't see any reason to think that the notion of causation requires reference to some sort of framework of time and space that existed prior to the universe beginning. I think that time and space, it can come into being and begin to exist at the beginning of the universe. And that is the common understanding in the standard Big Bang model. It's not just all matter and energy, but space and time themselves that come into being at the initial cosmological singularity. So I think that this is perfectly reasonable to believe. And I think that also we can talk about the causation of such an initial beginning event. For example, I think it makes sense to talk about timeless causation. I don't see why you can't have a timeless cause that would be causally related to effects. For example, take abstract objects like numbers, propositions, possible worlds, and properties. Suppose God is causally related to these things. It seems to me that God could exist timelessly and cause these things to also exist timelessly. So I don't see any need for time in order for there to be a causal relationship between one entity and another. Now, you might say, well, but obviously the universe is not a timeless abstract object. It is something that exists in time. How can you have God related to the beginning of the temporal universe? And what I would want to say here is that it also makes good sense to talk about simultaneous causation, namely that the action of the cause is simultaneous with the production of the effect. They occur at the same time, coincidentally. And this seems to make perfectly good sense. The moment at which God creates the universe is the moment at which the universe comes into being. It would be bizarre to say that God causes the universe to come into being at one moment, and then at a later moment, the universe comes into being. These would be coincidental or simultaneous in their relation. So it seems to me that you can have a causal relation that is simultaneous, and this would be the way in which I understand God's causing the first time of the universe.
Amazing. Thank you, Dr. Craig. And here is one similar question. Sorry for this, but this is hardest objection I could find. So how do we know that the universe had a true beginning rather than simply being a transition from a previous state, given the limits of our observations and understanding of physics at extreme energy scales?
Mm-hmm. Well, remember the second premise of the Kalam cosmological argument is that the universe began to exist. And I offer, in support of that premise, both philosophical arguments against the infinitude of the past, as well as scientific confirmation that the universe began to exist. And if those philosophical arguments are sound, they necessitate that the universe had a beginning. Those are arguments against the possibility of an infinite regress of causes, that the regress of causes must be finite and therefore terminate in an absolutely first uncaused cause. And so those metaphysical, philosophical arguments, I think, give us good grounds for thinking this is a true and absolute beginning rather than just a transition from a previous state. Now, as for the scientific arguments, these are based upon the expansion of the universe and the large-scale thermodynamic properties of the universe. And in both cases, I would say that there are no mathematically consistent, empirically tenable models of the universe that can be extrapolated to the infinite past. In order to be physically tenable, these cosmological models have to have a universe that is finite in the past and therefore began to exist. So that these also would require an absolute, or as you put it, true beginning.
Can you just name those arguments? You said scientific and philosophical argument for beginning. So let's say it.
With regard to the philosophical arguments, I present, first of all, an argument based on the impossibility of the existence of an actually infinite number of things. I think that there can be a potentially infinite number of things in the sense that you can have a process that goes on forever toward infinity as a limit, but it never arrives at infinity. It is always growing toward infinity, but is at every point finite. By contrast, an actual infinite would be a collection of elements that has an actually infinite number of elements in it. It would be complete. And I think you can show that various absurdities result if you think that actually infinite collections of things can exist. And since a beginningless past would involve an actually infinite number of past events, that implies that the number of past events must be finite and that therefore the universe began to exist. Now, the second argument is that you cannot form a collection of an actually infinite number of things by successively adding one member after another. Sometimes this is called the impossibility of counting to infinity. No matter how long you count, you can never count to infinity because you can always add one more before you arrive at infinity. But if the universe is infinite in the past, then in a sense, we have counted down from infinity, ending in the present. This would be like counting down all the negative numbers, ending at zero, which is, I think, even more absurd a task, trying to count to infinity. So those two arguments, I think, would give good metaphysical grounds for thinking that the universe is finite in the past and therefore had an absolute beginning.
What about a cyclical or oscillating model where time stretches infinitely into the past without a true beginning?
These oscillating models were tried during the 1970s, especially by Soviet scientists, and they soon proved to be untenable. In fact, the thermodynamic properties of these oscillating models actually implied the very beginning of the universe that they were intended to avoid. And you can try to get around these problems by various maneuvers, but it always results in some physically untenable feature of signals. They are attended by messy singularities that would destroy the oscillations and subvert the process, so that there are no successful oscillating models that can be extended to past infinity. This is really a bygone feature of contemporary cosmogony, just as much as, say, the old steady state models are.
Yeah, great. And next, couldn't there be a category of things that begin to exist without cause, such as quantum fluctuations or virtual particles?
It's important to understand that neither quantum fluctuations nor virtual particles begin to exist without a cause. I remember talking a few years ago with a quantum physicist from Purdue University who said, I don't understand why people say this. She said, we can trace the causal chain from the effect back along the series of causes. It's just that these causes act indeterministically rather than deterministically. They're still there. Quantum mechanics knows nothing of something coming into being from nothing without any causal conditions whatsoever. For example, these fluctuations or virtual particles presuppose the reality of the so-called quantum vacuum, which is a roiling sea of energy governed by physical laws in which these fluctuations and particles occur. So this is simply a misrepresentation on the part of popularizers when they think that this represents creation from nothing.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, and couldn't the universe have always existed in some form, just like that, without any true beginning or cause?
Well, not if those two metaphysical arguments I gave are sound arguments, and I am persuaded they are. If those are good arguments, then the universe must gone to exist. The series of past events is only and therefore must terminate at some point in the finite past. Moreover, this scientific confirmation from the Big Bang and the thermodynamic properties gives us very good reason to think that the true model that actually describes our universe is one that involves a genuine beginning at some point in the finite past.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. Great. And does the causal principle necessarily apply to all domains, including the quantum realm, where certain events appear to occur without a clear cause? And if not, how can we know that the causal principle applies to the universe as a whole, given that it is based on observations within the universe?
Again, I think this has been implicitly answered in what I've already said. The causal principle that everything begins to exist at cause is a physical principle and therefore applies to anything that exists. It is not limited to certain physical domains. It's a principle of metaphysics that out of nothing, nothing comes. But I would add as well, Nemanja, that in the quantum realm, it's not even undisputed that things are indeterminate there. Many theorists are sympathetic with models of quantum mechanics, according to which indeterminism is simply an epistemic uncertainty. It's in our minds. We don't know the determining causes, but nevertheless, they are there in reality. And so the question would be, is indeterminism ontic? That is to say, does it describe reality, or is it merely epistemic, just a feature of our uncertainty? And there are at least 10 different physical interpretations of the mathematical equations of quantum mechanics, and some of these are as fully deterministic as Newton's physics. So it's simply not true that quantum mechanics furnishes a proven example to the causal principle, because it isn't the case that indeterminism has been demonstrated to be ontic rather than merely epistemic.
Does the Borde-Gat-Vilenkin theorem necessarily imply a beginning to the universe, or could it be interpreted differently in the context of alternative models of cosmology, such as loop quantum cosmology or string theory?
The Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem has only one very general condition for its application. It applies to any universe which on average has been in a state of cosmic expansion throughout its history. That's it. If your universe model fulfills that one single condition, then the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem will apply to it and imply a beginning of the universe. Now, as you mentioned, there are models that don't meet that one condition, such as a loop quantum cosmology. But then, as Alexander Vilenkin explains, these theories inevitably run into other difficulties that make them physically untenable as models of the universe. For example, I mentioned the messy singularities that would arise in oscillating models. So the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, I think, is a very powerful demonstration that the universe is finite in the past, because the exotic models that try to constitute exceptions to it run into all sorts of other physical problems that eliminate them as plausible contenders for a true model of the universe.
Okay, nice. And is it possible that our understanding of the Big Bang as the beginning of the universe is merely a classical approximation to a more fundamental quantum mechanical process that does not require a true beginning?
Well, I think it is certainly correct to say that the classical Big Bang model that features an origin in a cosmological singularity at some point in the finite past will need to be amended by the introduction of quantum mechanics. And this has already been done by various theories like Alexander Vilenkin, or more famously, Stephen Hawking and James Hartle with their no boundary proposal. So quantum cosmology is a cottage industry in contemporary cosmology. And again, what is so fascinating about this is the introduction of quantum theories of gravity do not serve to restore the infinite past. Models like Vilenkin's and the Hartle-Hawking model still involve a beginning of the universe at some point in the finite past, even if it doesn't involve an initial singularity at which all the laws of physics break down. So the correct understanding of the Big Bang will require the marriage of quantum mechanics with general relativity theory, but there are no grounds for thinking that this is going to restore the infinitude of the past.
Looks like there is a beginning, just.
I think so.
Yeah. Next, how do we reconcile the notion of a beginning to the universe with the second law of thermodynamics, which seems to require a past eternal universe in order to explain the arrow of time?
I'm puzzled by this question, Nemanja, because the exact opposite is true. If you want to try to reduce the arrow of time to the thermodynamic entropy increase, then you have to adopt what is called the past hypothesis. And that is that the universe began to exist at some point in the finite past in an arbitrarily low entropy condition. And ever since then, it has been increasing in entropy right on to the present and into the future. So far from avoiding the finitude of the past, trying to explain the thermodynamic arrow of time by increasing entropy really virtually forces you to adopt the view of the past as finite. Now, I don't think that we should reduce the arrow of time to thermodynamics. I think time is a metaphysical quantity, not a physical quantity, and that even in the absence of physical events, there could be time. So I wouldn't try to ground the arrow of time in thermodynamics. Nevertheless, having said that, the thermodynamic properties of the universe as a whole does seem to require that the universe has not existed for infinite time. For if the universe has existed for infinite time, then we should already exist in a sort of thermodynamic heat death. That is to say, a dark, dilute, lifeless state. And we don't exist in such a state. We exist in a state of disequilibrium, where there's still plenty of energy to be used. And so the large scale thermodynamic properties of the universe point to the past finitude of the universe and an initial low entropy condition in which our universe began.
Oh, great answer. This is logical. Okay. And the last question about first stage, we are really fast. If we apply Grim Reaper paradox symmetrically and imagine an infinite sequence of Grim Reapers, each set to act in the future, then if the future is endless, we have a contradiction because no single Grim Reaper can be the first to act, and every Grim Reaper expects a future one to act. But if there were no first Grim Reaper to act, none would act. Even if we assume that God is timeless, God can still form intentions that have effects in time. So that is a problem for a Christian understanding of eschatology, which considers saved people to be eternally saved in the infinite future. What is your response?
But I think in order for our listeners to understand this question, we need to say something about what this so-called Grim Reaper paradox is. So let me share with our listeners what it is. Imagine that you are alive at midnight, but imagine that there is a Grim Reaper who is going to cut you down and kill you at 1 a.m. if you're still alive then. But suppose there's another Grim Reaper who will cut you down and kill you at 12:30 a.m. if you're still alive then. But then suppose there's a third Grim Reaper who will cut you down at 12:15 if you're still alive then, and so on ad infinitum. What the paradox implies is that you cannot live past midnight, and yet you cannot be killed by any grim reaper, because you would already be dead before he could swing his scythe and kill you. And this is used as an argument against the idea that the time and space are composed of an actually infinite number of points or instants. Now, you mentioned trying to create a symmetrical Grim Reaper paradox about the future that would be a problem. And I must say, I don't understand that, because in the Grim Reaper paradox, as I just stated, it is about the future. You're alive at midnight, but you'll be cut down at 1 a.m. That's in the future if you're still alive then. But you'll be cut down at 12:30 a.m. if you're still alive then. You'll be cut down at 12:15 a.m. if you're still alive then, and so on, right back as arbitrarily close to midnight as you want to get. So that is a paradox about the future, and this has been applied to show the finitude of the past. But it doesn't in any way imply that the future is finite. I suppose the symmetrical version would be that the Grim Reaper at 12:30 a.m. will cut you down only if he knows the Grim Reaper at 1 a.m. will not cut you down. But the Grim Reaper at 12:15 knows that he will cut you down only if the Grim Reaper at 12:30 does not cut you down, and so on and so forth. Now, I don't see where the problem is. There's no paradox there. If any of the Grim Reapers act, then it is true that the future Grim Reapers will not cut you down. So nothing prevents them from cutting you down. Each one could kill you, because then the later ones will not swing their scythes and kill you. So I think that this so-called paradox, at least as you've explained it, just seems to be malformed. It doesn't make sense.
Dr. Craig, thank you. This is a wonderful answer. And do we have maybe time to open even second stage, or we rather go?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, okay, nice. So second stage, even if we consider that there is a cause of the universe, why would the cause be God and not zero-dimensional point as proposed by Quentin Smith?
Yes. I mentioned before that when you arrive at the conclusion that there is a first uncaused cause of the universe, then a number of properties fall out by a conceptual analysis of what this cause must be. It must be beginningless. It must be uncaused. It must be changeless. Otherwise, you would have an infinite regress of events. Therefore, it cannot be material, because material objects always involve change, at least on the atomic and molecular levels. Therefore, it must be timeless and spaceless, because things that exist in time and space are constantly changing. It must be enormously powerful, because it brought the universe into being from nothing. And I would argue, finally, that it must be personal. And I give three different arguments for the personhood of this uncaused first cause. So I think you would agree that this gives us a very theologically rich concept of the first uncaused cause. It is a beginningless, uncaused, immaterial, timeless, spaceless, unimaginably powerful personal creator of the universe.
Nice, but one objection to spaceless attribute is it doesn't need to be spaceless. It could be just out of that space where is universe. How you respond to that?
Oh, I don't think that this is correct at all. One of the striking things about space is that something doesn't need to be spatial in order to cause space, because the creation of space is not itself a spatial act. Contrast, for example, pushing something or leaping over something. Those are spatial activities. You can't push something or leap over something unless you are yourself in space. But the creation of space itself isn't a spatial act and therefore doesn't need to involve some sort of pre-existing space. So God can exist spacelessly and yet create space.
All right, and why it must be personal cause?
For those who want to read the entire question, please pause the video to read it because the question is too long. The question is essentially, why should we think the cause of the universe is personal?
Yeah, well, let me respond to that a little bit. I think that libertarian free will makes perfect sense, and that you and I have a firsthand experience of libertarian free will. I see no reason to think that we are causally determined in everything that we think and do. And so, unless there's some sort of overwhelming argument against libertarian freedom, I'm going to presuppose that this is a coherent notion because I myself experience my own libertarian free will. Now, notice that your questioner doesn't seem to deny that if the cause of the universe is timeless, sans the universe, without the universe, as I argue, then it would need to be some sort of free agent. But he suggests perhaps you could have something that is an indeterministically acting cause, such as you have in physical systems like quantum mechanics. Well, once again, here we see quantum mechanics trying to come to the rescue by positing indeterminism. And I think the fundamental problem here is that the cause of the universe cannot be any kind of physical reality because it brings time and space into being. And so the only sort of indeterministic causal factor that would be consistent with being an immaterial, transtemporal, transspatial being is a personal agent who is endowed with freedom of the will, a sort of cosmic mind that brings the universe into being. Otherwise, I think what our friend is talking about is just mumbo jumbo. He's positing indeterministic causes without having any idea of what this actually is.
Okay, and the last one about enormous powerful.
Shouldn't the cause of the universe be just enormously powerful rather than omnipotent?
Yes, I think that's right. And that's why, you notice, I don't claim to prove that this being is omnipotent. Theists believe God is an omnipotent being, all powerful. And that would exceed what the argument proves. So my conclusion is much more modest. It's saying he has to be powerful enough to create the universe from nothing, that is to say, without any material cause. And I think it's fair to characterize that sort of a cause as enormously powerful, wouldn't you? We don't need to say he's omnipotent, but I think we'd need to say that he is enormously powerful if this cosmic creator is able to create the entire universe without any material cause. That's pretty darn powerful.
Okay, great answer. And Dr. Craig, can you just say what is conclusion of this, why this matters, and can you send just any message to our listeners and people who
Yeah.
struggle with this?
Well, think about the conclusion of the argument. It means that beyond our universe, there exists an uncaused, beginningless, immaterial, spaceless, timeless, enormously powerful, personal creator of the universe, which is what most people mean by God. And therefore, I think it becomes incumbent upon us to ask the question, has this God, has this creator revealed himself in some way that we could know him more intimately? Or has he remained aloof and distant from the world that he has made? The argument thus far is consistent with any of the great monotheistic faiths of the world, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, or even deism. And so, which of those, if any, is true, will be the next stage of the argument? Has this personal creator revealed himself to mankind in some way that we might know him more personally, or has he remained aloof and distant from his creation?
Dr. Craig, thank you. And can you just say to people where they can follow you, and can you?
Yes, we have a website, reasonablefaith.org, reasonablefaith.org, and it has thousands and thousands of pieces of material there. I write a weekly question of the week in which I respond to a question from a viewer. And we have numerous articles and videos at the website. All of this is free of charge. And so we hope that folks will take advantage of that. I'd always also encourage folks to sign up for the newsletter that we send out on a monthly basis, keeping folks informed about my philosophical activities, as well as any speaking or interviewing that I might be doing, like this podcast today.
Okay, so maybe we expect maybe one more interview with you. So we hope for that. And dear viewers, please subscribe to our channel, like and comment, and share to your friends. And thank you for your attention and your time. And Dr. Craig, thank you very much. This is wonderful. And I believe that our listeners really enjoyed and learned something new. So thank you, and see you maybe next time.
You're welcome.